Hi, everybody, and welcome to our final lecture, which is going to focus on mental disorders in children. So children can suffer from mental illness just as well as adults can. A lot of mental illnesses will manifest themselves in childhood, but it also tends to manifest a little bit differently in young people, which will frequently act as a precursor to a more serious diagnosis in adulthood. So first responders are going to come across children all the time, whether those children are victims, witnesses, members of a community in need in the middle of some sort of crisis. So it's important to understand the context of their mental illness, how they're going to behave, that is very specific to their age group. So the first is oppositional defiance disorder. And this disorder is characterized by a demonstration of anger, spiteful, nasty behavior, purposeful agitation of others, defiance in the face of adults, complete defiance of the rules, defiance of authority figures, open resentment, and just general antagonistic behaviors. Children with this disorder do not respond to typical discipline or boundaries. Because then that discipline and those boundaries just simply become the new focus of their opposition and their defiance. Children who have oppositional defiance disorder, however, are unique in that they will still engage with adults who are important to them. So they will still engage with parents. Maybe if they have a favorite teacher, they will be better for that teacher. However, this is a precursor to a more serious instance that we call, or a more serious disorder specific to children that we call conduct disorder. And conduct disorder is like the next step up from oppositional defiance disorder. Children with conduct disorder tend to perceive literally or inappropriately that they have been abandoned in some capacity. And maybe they have, or maybe it's a misperception. But either way, it is their experience. It's their perception that they've been abandoned by their caretakers or parental figures. Even if their parental figures are there, they haven't been given proper care, proper attention, proper nurturing, proper parenting, right? And therefore, they've never been taught accountability for actions and behaviors, boundaries, limits, consequences, etc. So they often perceive rules and boundaries to be completely unfair because they don't understand the concept of it. They've never been taught any of that. And they don't respect rules. They don't respect boundaries. They don't know how to manage their behavior. They have an inability to read social cues and feedback. So they have no ability when when an adult is getting angry and they're headed towards sanctioning you with a consequence, they can't see that coming. They don't know what that means because they haven't had that engagement with their parental figures to learn those social cues, those nonverbal cues, and that nonverbal communication. That inability to read those social cues just exacerbates bad behavior because they don't ever see it coming, so they don't ever dial their behavior back. And ultimately what we see is that children with conduct disorder become very physically aggressive with other children. They become physically aggressive and violent with animals. They have a background and a history of bullying, chronic lying. It's not uncommon for these children to have a history of being in possession of weapons, and they have a much higher likelihood of perpetrating sexual assaults against their peers. Running away is very common. Theft, destruction of other people's property is very common. Fire setting is very common. Many children will fall into this disorder. And this is, like we said, oppositional defiance disorder is where it tends to start. And if oppositional defiance disorder isn't gotten under control, it just grows into conduct disorder. Unfortunately, conduct disorder is the childhood precursor to antisocial personality disorder, which we already discussed, and which you know probably is psychopathy. So this is sort of the childhood version. It's not sort of, it is the childhood version. And we see this manifest before we see adults go into full-blown antisocial personality disorder. Many kids who have conduct disorder will fall into delinquency, so they will become very well known to first responders, law enforcement in particular, firefighters as well, for the destruction of property and setting of fires. They are likely to be at the center of domestic disturbances among families because parents they can't control them, and it escalates, and they are very reactive. Public disturbances, public damage, and just general delinquency. So you're going to come into contact with these kids. What we do try to do is intervene at a young age before this can grow into antisocial personality disorder. We utilize cognitive behavioral therapy to better their problem-solving skills, to teach them how to manage stress, to teach them better communication and to teach them to control their impulsivity so that this doesn't continue to morph into antisocial personality disorder in their adulthood. There are also a category of disorders that are called pervasive developmental disorders. And this is a spectrum of disorders that is characterized by atypical brain development and atypical brain function. Often this is going to be most obviously manifested through an inhibition in an ability to express and read emotional communication and regulation. This doesn't impact cognitive ability. It has no impact on intelligence of any form, but it may absolutely inhibit the child's ability to express themselves. If a child is unable to successfully express themselves, certainly in an emergency situation or a trauma situation, they're going to experience frustration and they're going to experience lashing out as a result. So it's really important to recognize these, that they have this deficit of language, and it's important to find a way to work around that. So, first responders are going to come across kids with pervasive developmental disorders, whether it's administering medical care, responding to natural disasters, responding to some kind of conflict that happened specifically because of that lack of communication and inability to communicate with others that results in conflict. So it's really important for first responders to understand that you're going to need more time with these individuals. You're going to need more patience and understanding when communicating, and you're going to need to try and de-escalate for somebody who falls into one of these. So autism is a pervasive developmental disorder. We have some really widespread autism awareness generally in our culture, but there's always room for understanding and knowing more. This disorder exists on a spectrum, right? So there are people who are very high functioning with autism, and there are people who are very low functioning. On the lower end of the spectrum, you're going to see people who cannot verbally communicate at all, who may never live independently, will always need some sort of care. And at the opposite end, you may see somebody who is verbal and social, maybe a little bit awkward according to traditional conventions of social exchange, but can hold a job, can work, can be independent, etc. Many children with autism will start out with minimal verbal skills, and those verbal skills with proper therapies, treatment, and support will grow as they age, right? So it will actually expand. So hopefully when it's diagnosed, that's as bad as it's going to get, and hopefully it's only going to get better from there throughout their life course, but it is a constant process of support, therapy, learning, etc. Some children are verbal, but they're still very limited as to understanding and reading facial expressions, nonverbal feedback, emotional communication. They just lack the ability to understand it. So that sets itself up for all sorts of frustration and conflicts because they literally they can't read that. So much of our communication is nonverbal, right? So they're missing a lot of communication, which can cause issues on all sides. Age of onset is usually by the age of 3. It's identified by, delays in developmental delays in language, impaired social interaction, that inability to read the nonverbal communication, and the presence of idiosyncratic conversations. As a first responder, it's really important to remember that these responses are not meant to be difficult or whatever. It's from a legitimate limitation. And when kids who have autism experience high levels of stress, they're going to get more agitated and more upset than a child who doesn't have autism, especially because they have a harder time expressing it and they have a harder time understanding your response to it. I also want to talk about Asperger's disorder. This falls on the autism spectrum. Okay, so it displays mild characteristics of autism. These are going to be very high functioning people that are able to take care of themselves and speak and go to school and the whole shebang. They're often coupled with exceptional talents and very high IQs. So these are individuals who are exceedingly intelligent, right? Very, very smart. They don't have a language delay. They do have that inability to read social feedback, nonverbal communication. They have a hard time understanding how social engagement functions in general. right? This can also lead this, like I said, to frustration. It can lead to misunderstandings where people get upset or people get angry. And that can, when somebody with Asperger's disorder experiences that frustration, that stress, that social exchange gone wrong, they tend to engage in stimming behaviors, rocking behaviors, which can be, disconcerting and upsetting to people who don't understand it, right? So they might rock back and forth, or they might do what's called stimming, where they engage in a repetitive behavior that is actually very calming to them. So it's important to be able to recognize that and understand what's happening when that happens, so that you can respond in kind. Again, to the untrained eye, you might think this kid is just being difficult or ornery or whatever. They're not. These are literal limitations that come with pervasive developmental disorders. Want to switch gears? We talked a little bit about this before, which is attention deficit disorder or attention deficit with hyperactivity, often referred to as ADHD. This is commonly diagnosed in childhood, and what you're going to see when you communicate with a child who has ADHD or ADD is extreme amounts of impulsivity, the inability to concentrate, the inability to sit still, the inability to stop moving, right? They have an exceptional amount of energy, and it's very hard for them to cue in on what you're saying, understand what you're saying, and provide the response that you're looking for. So it's important to be able to recognize that as well, that okay, this child obviously, seems to have ADHD. How can we come at this from a different angle? And it's also important to understand that because of all of their symptomology, that kids who have ADHD are more likely to be on the receiving end of negative feedback from their parents, from teachers, from adults, from society in general, which leads to a lot of frustration, and definitely that knee-jerk reaction to authority figures. So, when first responders are engaging with them, you want to have that contextual understanding. There needs to be patience. There needs to be understanding. And it's very successfully treated with stimulants, typically Ritalin or Concerta are the most common go-tos. And finally, I want to close all of class with talking about PTSD among children, because children can experience post-traumatic stress disorder just as adults can. Typically, we see it in adults, like I said, who have served in the military, who are firefighters, who are police officers, who see a lot of trauma, a lot of carnage, a lot of EMS workers, in these very high stress, very traumatic experiences. But certainly trauma and abuse can create a PTSD reaction in a child as well. So kids who have been physically abused, sexually abused, or severely neglected are likely to experience PTSD just as adults have. I think this is important to recognize, but I also think it's because so many first responders experience PTSD, it gives you a line of communication with kids who are experiencing this, who are going to be withdrawn, who it's going to be harder to communicate with them. You've likely experienced it. You know what those experiences are like on a firsthand basis, which gives you a level of empathy that you won't have with most people who experience mental illness of any age. And it gives you an insight as to how to approach them and how to handle them. How do you want to be approached? How do you want to be managed when you experience these things? So recognizing PTSD in children, they're going to have exaggerated startle responses that are over the top, right? Because they're in abusive situations. They might be very clingy to an adult. They might have behavioral regression. So that, I might be 8 years old, but I'm acting more like I'm 4, right? And it's a coping response and mechanism to that trauma, to that stress. A regression in toilet training is a key indicator. Something's amiss here, right? That this is a 10-year-old kid who is clearly toilet trained, potty trained, and suddenly they are not, right? That's a clear indicator that something is wrong. They tend to be hyper alert because they're always on the lookout for potential abuse or blow-ups from adults that they can hopefully avoid. So they tend to be overly alert. They tend to have poor peer relationships because they don't know how to engage with people. They've never been properly taught how to engage with adults, let alone their peers. They engage in isolationism because it's safer, right? Like being alone is a place where I can't get hurt. I can't be abused. So they tend to self-isolate. Other things that are telltale signs are going to be, school failures, not doing well in school, grades dropping. They're also likely to engage in dangerous behaviors, risk-taking behaviors. right? And they may have poor language skills and poor memory skills. So these are all really important to recognize as to how you engage with them, but also because you are all mandated reporters as well. That this can give you an insight into if there is a larger problem at hand that needs further investigation.